You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Earlier this month, I had interviewed the president and founder of Strong Towns, Chuck Marohn, about his latest book, Escaping the Housing Trap. A very timely conversation, as our nation grapples with the housing crisis, not being able to house enough people, and why houses are just so darn expensive for first-time homebuyers. But alas, due to technical issues I'm not going to get into, that conversation is going to have to be postponed for another day once I can tackle the editing audio glitches. And so while that episode will be coming shortly, I thought while we're waiting, I will just repost or repurpose an old episode. As I'm sure many of you have forgotten some of the episodes from years gone by, and perhaps some of you have not listened to all 171 episodes of Saving Elephants. This one's reaching back there to 2021, where I had the pleasure of welcoming Dr. George H. Nash to the podcast. Dr. Nash has written a number of books, my favorite of which, and I have often mentioned this, is what I consider to be the gold standard in the history of American conservatism, is the book entitled The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. Quite a mouthful there. A very thick and intimidating book, but again, probably the gold standard in trying to understand the intellectual history in the United States of this thing that we call conservatism. And so I was thrilled to welcome the author of this amazing book, written first in the 1970s and since has gone through 4 revisions, to the Saving Elephants podcast to demystify this complicated story of just how intellectual conservatism came to be. Now, at the end of this throwback episode, I spent some time engaged in listener mail where I'm answering a listener's question about whether or not I consider Donald Trump to be an existential threat to the United States. And the timing here is very interesting because this episode aired in June of 2021, so this was relatively shortly after the January 6th incursion in the United States Capitol, encouraged by Donald Trump. The listener was essentially asking, look, you said in the 2020 election neither Biden nor Trump was an existential threat. Did you change your mind in the advent of January 6th? I thought I would just exclude that since that was kind of a timepiece back then, but I've left that tidbit at the end of this episode intact because I think my answer, honestly, largely holds true today, even though obviously a lot has changed since then. I think my views on the Trump administration and the potential danger he represents to the Republic have largely been unchanged for these past 4 years. So stick around if you want to hear my response to the listener question at the end of the episode, but before that, I give you my conversation with Dr. George Nash.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
It is an honor and a pleasure to have you with us for this episode. As I have shared with you, I'm a big fan of, I know you've written many books, but in particular, I'm a big fan of your book, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America. Its full title, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. I wanted to start right there. Why did you date your book 1945 looking onward? What was it about that year or that era that helps you chart, here's kind of where the modern conservative story in America begins?
Yes, well, thank you for your kind words there. It's a pleasure to be with you on this broadcast. I think I started for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the conservative movement, as it came to be known, one could more or less tell that already because I was living when it was very vibrant. I was doing my doctoral dissertation at Harvard in the early 70s. And so I was watching a phenomenon, this phenomenon of conservatism, and I knew where it seemed to have had its roots. World War II ended in 1945, and I think that's a fundamental point to make. And there was a sense in the world that a new world was coming into being, symbolized by the bifurcation of the world into the communist camp and the West, and also the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a sense that there was a new world emerging. The Great Depression was seemingly over, and so that meant there was a sense of a new beginning. There were 16 million Americans in uniform in the course of World War II, out of a population of a little over 120 million, I believe. And they came back, and there was a GI Bill that sent lots and lots of them into college. There's a boom that began in schooling, and the baby boom, and so forth. So there was a sense of a kind of a new beginning, and that we had moved beyond some of the issues, or at least the configurations of politics that had existed before the advent of a world war. Now, one of the three initial components of what became the conservative Renaissance, if you will, was the classical liberal or libertarian wing. And that had roots that go back before 1945, when we could look at it in larger perspective. Many of those people had battled against the New Deal as a form of collectivism, as they saw it. But during World War II, although there was politics at home, there was a sense of national focus on this enormous world war. And at the end of World War II, those classical liberal voices felt themselves very much being passed by history. So it becomes, in a sense, a period of beginnings for those elements that become the triumvirate, if you will, of conservatism, the libertarians, the traditionalists, and the Cold Warriors. And of course, the Cold War begins at the end, you might say, of World War II. So for all those reasons, it seemed like that was as good a point as any to start tracing what became this configuration that grew and so forth, and created a storyline. So I had been told, as a historian in graduate school, historian in training, so to speak, that it's important to get your story from point A to point B. In other words, you have a beginning, you have a termination, you have a story to tell. History is story. It's also analysis and so forth, but it should be a story. And as I examined the situation, the possibility of that topic, it seemed to me that for the reasons I've just given, it was an appropriate place to begin. There was no organized conservative movement, or even much usage of the word conservatism in 1945. And yet, within a short course of time, that word became very popular. A movement got underway, or different streams of thought that came together in the 50s. And so it seemed like as good a point as any. I didn't have any a priori reason to focus on 1945. I was once accused, I guess, of trying to downplay the classical liberals, because they, after all, had a history before 1945, but their history seemed to them to have come to an end in terms of influence at that point in time. So they kind of got back up and fighting again, and I take the point of them from that point on. But I do talk about some of the antecedents. But in terms of a movement now, that's a key word in my title of my book, in terms of an organized effort of my intellectuals to define and refine a philosophy, and to make it, apply it to social analysis, and then eventually have political impact. That really is a phenomenon that occurred essentially starting in the late 40s. And it happened that in 1944, Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, which is one of the foundational texts that I analyze in my book. And that becomes a point of rallying for those in the classical liberal camp. And it was not long after that that other books appeared that had a similar influence.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think that's an important distinction, that we're talking about movement conservatism. Right, that it's not, because I'm thinking of Russell Kirk in his book, The Conservative Mind. I mean, he charts a lot of common threads or impulses, if you will, of conservatism, going at least back to Edmund Burke, and then kind of up until the very point where you start off almost. But it's this nascent kind of movement that becomes more a political force that we're talking about here. Is that a fair representation of what you mean?
I think that's a good way to say it. I want to emphasize that my focus in the book was on intellectuals. I was not writing a political history of conservatism as such. Now, figures who had political importance, like Senator Taft and Barry Goldwater, make appearances in the book, Reagan later on. But I was not focusing on how they got to power and so on. I was focusing more on the worldview that they exemplified, and the intellectual ingredients of political conservatism, or what became political conservatism. But you make a good point. The people I studied were not people who were just trying to sit in their ivory towers and write tomes and tracts and so forth and have a kind of a very arcane discussion of things. It was a force that really wanted to change the course of history and to resist what it saw as dangerous forces out there. So it always had a political dimension, but what I wanted to do was to analyze the intellectual roots and development of that. And yet you can't keep it into narrow boundaries like that because of the nature of the phenomenon. These were people, many of them, like Russell Kirk even, who had some political involvement from time to time. So yes, it's intellectual conservatism, but it's pushing out to try to define and direct the traffic, so to speak, of the political grassroots people.
And if there is one common thread in your book I definitely picked up on, I think anybody who reads this would pick up on also, is that conservatism is not monolithic. It's not a single thing, right? Everyone is not in lockstep and complete agreement within this movement. And you have already mentioned three of, I believe you've numbered five, but three of the five groups, so maybe the prominent three, the libertarians, the traditionalists, and the anti-communists, there were kind of these various components that are wed or welded together. Can we spend just a brief moment kind of defining these? I think some will be very familiar to us and some others maybe not so much, but would you mind, can we go through all five of these and kind of briefly explain what they are, what they believe, and how they may have differed from the other four?
All right, that's a good question. You are quite right. I do not regard the conservative movement, at least that's my understanding of it, as a historian, as speaking with a single voice. I've sometimes used the metaphor that it was like a river that had several tributaries. At the beginning, that is to say in the mid-40s and into the early 50s, there were three rather separate phenomena that were operating more or less independently of one another. The first grouping are people that we would call classical liberals, or perhaps more frequently today, libertarians, who were particularly concerned about freedom, and especially economic freedom and the threat to a free society coming from statism, either the welfare state at home, represented by the New Deal, they argued, or socialism, fascism, communism abroad. And so their great enemy was that force called collectivism. And so in the name of individualism, as they often called themselves individualists, in the name of liberty, they wanted to resist this growing tendency to have state control over the economy and over society, which they argued would culminate really in a totalitarian state unless it was resisted. So a few names to mention quickly: Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, later on a bit Milton Friedman, and many others, the Chicago School and Austrian School of Economics. Many of those folks were, loosely speaking, in that camp. Now, they didn't know they were in a camp necessarily, but they founded the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947 as an effort to try to bring together more of these people from many countries who had a similar disposition and to iron out some of their differences and present an alternative to what they saw as the collectivist tide. The second group, represented by Russell Kirk in particular, who wrote the book The Conservative Mind in 1953, but also by people like Robert Nisbet, Richard Weaver, Peter Viereck, and many others, were taking a little different viewpoint on what they saw happening around them. They saw the rise of a rootless, increasingly secular mass society as a phenomenon in America and in the West, and that this was being it was a traditional society that was being weakened and turned into a mass society in which people were losing their sense of organic belonging, and that liberalism, as they saw it, modern liberalism, was a kind of acid that was seeping away at the institutional and ethical and spiritual sources of Western civilization. And I should say, just backing up briefly, that liberalism, modern liberalism, was also an opponent of the first groupings. So the two groups that I've mentioned thus far had a common foe, although they analyzed its weaknesses and fallacies in different ways. So liberalism was the ideology of statism, according to, or modern liberalism was, according to the first grouping. According to the traditionalists, it was a kind of acid that was going to create a hollowed out society, and into that society, lost of its moorings, of its traditional Judeo-Christian religious and moral underpinnings. Out of that kind of chaos would possibly emerge false gods like fascism, communism, and others that would try to bring new meaning to people, but a meaning that was not based on the heritage of the West. The third element that came out of the 40s was the rise of what I call a militant and evangelistic anti-communism. Many of the people in the lead in that grouping, people like Whittaker Chambers, a former communist, even a former communist spy, but who turned away from that, broke from that, and ended up as a kind of iconic figure for conservatives in the 1950s. People like that argued that the most dangerous form of statism on the planet was the expansionist evil empire of the Soviet Union under Stalin. Reagan called it the evil empire, but they all would have agreed with that formulation early on. So these three groupings were out there, and there were different little journals, there were places where they could write and so forth. But it came about in 1955 that William F. Buckley, Jr., a Yale graduate from the class of 1950, put together a magazine, National Review. I'm sure everyone listening knows of that journal and probably of Buckley. And he brought these three different groups. And again, group is a little bit strong a term, but there were definite discernible separate tendencies here. And he brought them together in the magazine National Review. It was anti-statist. It was traditionalist in arguing for the traditional moral and religious value systems of the West. And of course, it was anti-communist. And that became a kind of common rallying ground where a lot of the intellectual work proceeded. Now, just jumping ahead to complete the five-part story here, somewhat later, and I'll be very brief on this, we might, if you want, talk about it in greater detail, in the late 60s and 70s, a phenomenon came about of people on the left, the moderate left, Cold War liberals, increasingly turning away from what they saw as the illiberal left and the far left. And they were becoming what some people called revisionist liberals, and what some of their left-wing opponents they called them neoconservatives. In other words, these were no longer good liberals, but they were going off into that bad territory of conservatism. And so they were neoconservatives. That was neoconservatives, a disparaging term for the opponents of these sort of center-left liberal intellectuals. Irving Kristol comes to mind, one of the leaders of it. He said that a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. And that became an important point, that they saw that reality around them was no longer congenial, and that people on the left were making mistakes. Well, I can go into it further if you like. So the neoconservatives sort of drifted toward the conservative camp, and eventually many of them became part of it, particularly in the 70s and the 80s. So these were people on the left who migrated to the right, who broke with the left. A few of them had been far left. Others were sort of Hubert Humphrey, Henry Jackson, Daniel Moynihan liberals who were having second thoughts and who got pushed away or found themselves being transported into more conservative directions. And finally, and this is a little different from an intellectual phenomenon, but it's an important one, and that was what some people have called the Great Awakening of the evangelicals in the late 70s and 80s. Has several sources. It's mostly evangelical Protestants, the religious right, it was called. We would say social conservatives today. The evangelicals, some Roman Catholics, some Orthodox Jews, who were convinced that the society, American society, was radically secularizing. Exemplified by some of the Supreme Court rulings that tended to marginalize religion in the public square, allowing prayer in the public schools, for example. And also, probably the most important single stress factor that animated a lot of these people and got them out of a previously rather apolitical stance was the Roe v. Wade decision and the arrival of abortion on demand, which they looked upon as the supreme abomination of the time. So they became a more populistic, if you will. It's not so much intellectuals organizing at the top, but people at the grassroots seeing what was happening in the schools, what they called secular humanism, another word for modern liberalism, was taking over, and it was threatening the transmission of their belief system to their children, you see. Now, eventually that group too got intellectual voices such as First Things magazine, for example. And so they all came together, and Buckley was a kind of leader and personification of many of those impulses. And Reagan, of course, became a political hero for them as well. So those are the 5 groupings. And I'm sorry if that's a little long, but it's hard to summarize such complexity in 5 minutes. So,
well, it admittedly is a rather unfair question if I was expecting a pithy answer. So thank you for going through the 5 of them. And I do appreciate you putting a sort of a bookend between the first 3, the libertarian, traditionalist, anti-communist, and then the latter 2, neoconservatives and the I guess what we call social conservatives. In that not only do they come later, and not only is it's probably incomplete. If all we knew was the first 3, if we're talking about today, is like, well, I don't know where some of these people who call themselves conservative fit in those 3 groups. So it's good to, you need all 5 of them. But the first 3 were the predominant forces, at least in the early modern movement history. And I mean, I suppose for younger, conservatives such as myself, from millennial generation, younger generations, the anti-communist is probably the furthest from us because we don't live in that world anymore. So there's no necessarily direct parallel, but we still to this day have the raging battles between, even if we don't call it this, the libertarians and the traditionalists. And if I'm understanding some of the argument you're laying out in the book is that was a real challenge trying to synthesize these. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. We might flesh these names out a bit more. We've already talked about Russell Kirk, but also Frank Meyer. You kind of used as sort of the bookends of representative sometimes of these 2 different elements that with Russell Kirk, it was more the Edmund Burke. It was the, look, we're not, we don't draw our strength from abstraction, right? It's not metaphysical first principles. Frank Meyer was all about first principles. It's about liberty and it's about order and I guess what eventually became fusionism. So I'm throwing a lot of words out here, but could you flesh out for us, what was that synthesis project that the early conservatives, the libertarians and the traditionalist camp were both fighting themselves over, but also trying to figure out how do we fuse this together?
Yes, well, that's again a very good question. The common forum for much of this project and discussion was Buckley's National Review. And it became apparent in the mid-50s that conservatives could not simply start a magazine at the intellectual level or have these intramural discussions, but they had to answer the question that was being thrown at them from the left. Well, what is conservatism? What is conservatism in America? Isn't America a liberal country? Isn't conservatism something they have over in Austria or someplace which is very foreign to the American experience? There were really 2 great intellectual challenges that they started to address. And one was that question, well, what does it mean to be a conservative? And secondly, what does it mean to be a conservative in America? And here I should point out, that going back to Russell Kirk, in 1953, he published a book, a great book called The Conservative Mind. And as you indicated, this was his effort to show that Edmund Burke was really the fount of modern conservatism as a phenomenon, modern in the sense of post-1789, post-French Revolution. And so he argued that although it had been a battered phenomenon, conservatism, over those century and a half or more, nevertheless, it was still alive, although he actually wanted to call his book The Conservative's Rout, because he was gloomy about the possibility of a revival. But anyway, his book did several things that are important here. It helps to set the context for Buckley's magazine and the debate that ensued in the magazine. What Russell Kirk did was to show that there was a phenomenon called conservatism, an intellectual tradition, It had intellectual respectability. It wasn't just yahoos in some strange corners of the land who were muttering about communist conspiracies or something like that, that it had intellectual voltage and respectability. And also, he really effectively gave the movement its name. And from that point on, conservatives could hold their heads a little higher because Kirk had demonstrated the intellectual substance of conservatism, or at least his variant of it. And that meant that they could overcome what I call the liberals' superiority complex. The liberals arguing that America is a liberal country, and all these people claiming otherwise are eccentric or lowbrow or populists or something like that. So the word conservatism stuck, and you have to remember the classical liberals didn't call themselves conservatives at first. The popular term for a while was individualist. And Buckley, incidentally, became, shortly out of Yale, in 1952, the first president of something called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. And that is now known to us today as ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. It changed its name eventually, but it was one of the first efforts to create a kind of conservative youth movement. And Buckley had just written, and this is important also, in 1951, a critique of his alma mater, Yale, God and Man at Yale, I think his most important single book. And he argued that Yale was undermining Western civilization. It was a very audacious book to write in two ways. He said it was basically indoctrinating students in Keynesian and other forms of statist economics, not free market economics, not Hayekian economics. And secondly, that it was really turning into effectively a secular place, and it was not giving moral instruction and direction for people of presumably primarily Christian background. And therefore, Buckley argued that Yale had to be reformed and that the alumni should basically take over the administration of the institution and see to it that people are taught the basic wisdom of our ancestors, to use a Kirk phrase, as well as free market economics in opposition to communism and so on. So, as you see right there, Buckley exemplified in that very book, God and Man at Yale, two of the three early pillars of conservatism. And he, of course, was an anti-communist, which logically enough followed from the other two. So we have all that background. But it's one thing to bring together a lot of writers, and then another to say, well, what do you guys stand for? And so there began a discussion, which quickly became a debate as to what it was that conservatives really wanted. Well, the traditionalists argued that the conservatives are trying to defend the traditional values of Western civilization, which to them, most of them, meant Christianity. And that therefore, what conservatives should be doing is try to instruct people in their society in leading a life of virtue, pursuit of the good life. Now, the free marketeers, were not thinking so much in those terms. They were thinking more about protecting, enterprise and private property from the encroachment of state control. And so many of them said freedom is the ultimate goal of what we want. We want freedom. And Frank Meyer, who was a former communist, but became an early stalwart at National Review, was very much a libertarian. But he argued that he criticized Russell Kirk as not having enough grounding in principle and being too much given to saying, well, we want to abide by the wisdom of our ancestors. Well, what does that mean? Which ancestors? Someone asked Kirk, and so forth. So a debate gets started about, well, what does Kirk mean by all that? And how do you reconcile these seemingly very different objectives? A life of virtue as what conservatism stands for, or a life of freedom. So to make a long and contentious story short, a great debate ensued in the late 50s and early 60s. One of Meyer's key opponents was Buckley's brother-in-law, a Catholic convert named Brent Bozell. And Bozell argued, and I want to quote Bozell here, it's a one-liner. Bozell's argued that the story of how the free society has come to take priority over the good society is the story of the decline of the West. And Bozell argued that you cannot have a totally libertarian political system. It'll lead to moral chaos. And if you idolize freedom, you're going to get anarchy and rebellion against the divine. And Meyer argued that freedom was essential. And you have to understand his own life experience here. He got out of Oxford in the early 30s, and he said there were two belief systems in the world that he could commit himself to. One was Christianity, one was communism. He chose communism. And for the next 14 years, he became a very active and relatively high-ranking Communist Party member, first in England and then in the United States, back in the United States where he was born. And then he broke with communism. And so he had lived under a very disciplined regimentation as a party apparatchik, and also an atheist and also a believer in collectivism. In breaking with all that, he did not want his individual dignity and freedom ever again compromised. And he said, we cannot allow authority to dictate virtue to people. He said, we have to allow people to be free to choose. They should choose virtue. But that making that choice should not be in the realm of government. Now, Kirk, of course, was arguing for tradition and arguing that the solitary individual can't be that wise. The individual needs moorings, needs guidance, the wisdom of our ancestors. Or as Kirk came to argue a little later on in reaction to criticism of him, he wanted what he called adherence to the permanent things, to norms, to natural law. And so it wasn't just this undefined wisdom of our ancestors, but something more substantive. So this debate goes back and forth, which is the highest good? And so Meyer eventually came up with a kind of a formula, and he wrote a whole book of political theory called In Defense of Freedom. But the formula that he argued was a true synthesis that really represented, when all was said and done, what the conservative movement in America stood for, and what America stood for going back to the founding in the late 18th century. He said that in the moral realm, virtue is the objective. But in the political realm, government exists to promote freedom of the individual, freedom from fraud, from external aggression, from violence. But other than that, not to dictate how people should live. And Meyer, reacting against communism, a false god that he had embraced for a number of years, was not going to allow anyone to try to create another authoritarian state. And he was afraid that Bozell or people like him, if they followed out their logic, would be allowing the government to coerce people into living the way someone says was virtuous. So Meyer argued that is the way you can reconcile these polarities. In the political realm, we stand for freedom, but we need to use freedom, and the use of freedom can be guided by non-governmental institutions, churches, synagogues, civil society, if you will. Now, that was a kind of quick formula. I tried to condense this into formulaic terms. And that became known pejoratively at first by Bozell. Oh, that's fusionism. You're trying to fuse together two incompatible elements. Well, Meyer didn't like the term, but the term stuck. And so a great debate ensued. And eventually, and we can discuss this further if you like, what turned out is that most conservatives argued that a kind of a de facto consensus had emerged, that really they wanted both things, and that you needed to avoid going to the extreme end of either possibility, authoritarian virtue-seeking, or anarchistic freedom-seeking in defiance of all morality and so forth. And so you needed a kind of a balance, a modus vivendi, and that became really what fusionism was. Some thought it was a theoretical synthesis and attempted it, notably Meyer. Others were not so sure that it was ever quite perfectly wrapped up, like Aquinas' Summa or something in perfect order that everyone could accept. Nevertheless, as a way to avoid being sectarian or doctrinaire, as a way of thinking, fusionism, I think, became really the de facto consensus. There were always objectors to it. If it had been a perfect synthesis, we wouldn't be still arguing about it 60 years later, I don't believe. The issues keep coming up every so often because there were people on each end, like Bozell, who said this fusionism doesn't work, and a few people on the extreme libertarian end, like Murray Rothbard, who said that this is phony and so forth. So there are always critics at either end. But in the middle there, and Buckley exemplified this, there was a sense that conservatives stood for both faith and freedom. And Buckley exemplified that, which is one reason why he is so important, because he was a Roman Catholic traditionalist. He was obviously a believer in the free markets, look at God and Man at Yale and so on. And he was an anti-communist. And I argue in my book that the anti-communist element was a very important one, not so much at the realm of theory, but as a kind of providing a kind of common ground for people, because the libertarians and the traditionalists could both look at communism and the Kremlin and say it's an enemy. It's an enemy of freedom. It's an enemy of faith. It's statism incarnate. And statism incarnate not only destroys economies, it destroys souls, or tries to regulate them and so on. So the threat of communism tended to bring them together in common ground. And also, I think it provided a kind of sobriety, so that you couldn't go off onto your own little corner and come up with some grand total truth that you want to impose on everyone else in the movement. You had to recognize that there were different emphases, as Meyer rather delicately put it, and some argue that was just words. It wasn't really the reality, but it seemed to work. And I think also, if you look beyond the intellectuals now who are arguing at the ground of high theory, to the common conservative subscribing to National Review or Human Events at the time and other popular conservative periodicals, you'd ask them what they believe. And they say, well, I want freedom. I want a free society. I want my kids to be free to go to school without being indoctrinated. But I also, most of them at the time, and this is a time of considerable religiosity in the American public, they wanted the freedom of worship. So it was a way that many people could say, look, these are not irreconcilable opposites. They are complementarities, and that they, in a sense, act as a check on the excesses potentially of the other one. And so on all those ways, as common ground and as balance and so forth, and as a way of thinking and a way of recognizing that what we believe as conservatives has many sources. You see, in all those ways, fusionism as a modus vivendi worked. Maybe not at the high level of theory for many people, but enough for this intermediate level of common ground and cooperation. It was more than just an alliance of convenience, but it was, and maybe not a perfect synthesis, but it represented, as I argue, or at least the conservatives felt that it did, it represented a kind of common ground, and it gave a kind of lingua franca to the conservative discourse as well. So I think that's where fusionism really succeeded, but it never succeeded in totally convincing its critics, of whom there are some considerable number today.
There definitely are. In fact, a recent guest I had on, Stephanie Slade from Reason Magazine, we did kind of a deep dive in Frank Meyer and fusionism, and and she made the point, the famous or infamous, depending on the side of the coin you're on, I suppose, First Things Magazine manifesto or article against the dead consensus. She makes this point that to call it the dead consensus is almost at least a passive acknowledgement that it has been predominantly the view on the right for many years. Yes. And I think that's an interesting. It has never been without critics, both in that day, both today, and I'm sure for all time to come. But it is interesting that it was that in some sense Frank Meyer won, or at least his voice still speaks louder to us today than maybe it would have been just obvious at the time. That he actually had kind of hit upon something. And there are two individuals in this book, Frank Meyer, who I knew of before, and Wilmore Kendall, who I did not, that you introduced me to. I would have loved to have met these guys in real life because they sound like real characters, to be honest with you. I mean, Frank, the way we've been talking about him, he sounds like this extremely magnanimous guy. He's just this complete, can't we all just get along? But you use this phrase about Frank Meyer in particular. I love this, that he was the ever alert center of heresy. And he fought everybody. He fought Russell Kirk, I mean, no, if you weren't quite pure enough for him, he's going to come after you. So it's hilarious to me that the guy who is probably most responsible for the sort of getting us fused together was also so interested in doggedly getting rid of the heretics within the movement.
Yes. Well, he called his column Principles and Heresies. And you have to remember, coming out of the communist movement, he had been something of an ideologist. And he looked upon at the dangers of deviationism. I don't mean that he was a hound of heresies or something like that, but he could see, that was the way his mind worked, I suppose, that if one wasn't careful, libertarianism could turn into what he called libertinism, or hyper-traditionalism could turn into hyper-traditionalism. Bozell, for example, lived in Spain some of the time under Franco. And his magazine really argued in ways that sometimes sound rather similar to what we hear today in some quarters, that America had been more or less liberal from the start and was in declension, therefore, from the start. So I quoted before, that the medieval image, the Christian image of a good society had been replaced by the free society, and it's been downhill for several centuries. So Meyer argued that America was worth saving, that it still had. We should not regard all as lost. He rejected those who would want to go over the edge into counter-revolution, although he argued also that conservatism could not simply twiddle its thumbs and repeat mantras, that it had to develop intellectually rigorous resistance to and critiques of the enemies on the left. So I think that Meyer's experience as an ideologue, if you will, in a way, of communism, made him maybe unusually sensitive to the theoretical problems that might arise if you weren't careful. And so he was really a theoretician of conservatism. And I don't think that was the temperament really of Russell Kirk, for example. Kirk was I would call Meyer a kind of theoretician. I would call Kirk really a man of letters, who often he wrote very differently from Meyer. Meyer did not use much literary metaphor, poetry, allusions to the great books as much as he was much more a debater, an arguer in a certain sense. And some would accuse him of being too much the rationalist type. And he was cheerfully argumentative. I never met him. I did converse with him by phone. That was the way I did my interview of him long ago. I never had the opportunity, sadly, to meet him. But I have met people who did know him, and he was a nocturnal person, and he would call people in the middle of the night and have long conversations. He'd sleep by day and so forth. He had an interesting life, and but many people who went to meet him found him quite charming, you see, and it was like a bull session going on in the night. So he attracted a lot of young people, as did Russell Kirk in his way, and that would be an important contribution of Kirk, actually, that Wilmore Kendall, whom you mentioned a moment ago, called Russell Kirk the sage of Mecosta, Michigan, which was Kirk's town where he lived in his adulthood primarily. So Russell Kirk had a kind of magnetism too in his way, but he tended to deal with the great books, Edmund Burke. He'd be quoting the great figures from ancient times before him. So it's you get a literary education from Kirk. You get a kind of a study of political theory from Meyer, and I'm not trying to say anything disparagingly of either one of them. In my view of conservatism, I would say that it should be thought of as a kind of an area where there's special division of labor, and different people have different, specialties and so forth. And one should be respectful of the wisdom or the contributions that come from many different corners, rather than trying to impose some kind of cookie cutter definition or rigor or platform on everyone. So, but that's just a little editorial statement there. But I wrote this book, I should add, perhaps at this moment, as a historian. It was my doctoral dissertation initially. I've updated it a couple of times, as you may know. And I wrote it as a historian, anxious that people of all political persuasions, perhaps, could gain benefit from reading it. So it wasn't meant to be a primer for fellow conservatives. I was then and am now a conservative, but I had a commitment, I thought a professional commitment as a historian, to try to be detached and objective and fair-minded and make the book more useful to people who might or might not agree with a Meyer or a Kirk or a Buckley. They might be out on the left. I've had some left-wing people tell me that they learned a lot about conservatism from my book. So I felt that was something that I wanted to accomplish, to have a book that could be accepted as scholarship and not as some kind of advocacy in disguise. But still, I have my preferences and so on, but I try to not to choose sides. I tried to let each side in this never-ending conservative conversation on the right have their say, because that to me was part of the fun of the project. There was no agreement on what conservatism was or what its emphasis should be at the start, and it's been a continuing process. People come along, face new circumstances and so forth, and try to reinterpret it. I was once asked by a professor of political science, when he heard that I had written this book, and it wasn't yet published, it was about to be, he said, well, how do you define conservatism? And I said, I don't. I say that the quest for a definition of conservatism was one of the key points about this whole group. And he kind of nodded. I think he found that persuasive. So I wasn't going to impose my little cookie cutter on people, say, well, so-and-so is or is not a true conservative. They let them argue it out and see what came about. And one thing that did come about, I think, was this fusionist consensus, or at least agreement to be on have civil discourse with one another with different emphases, as Meyer, as I say, rather artfully put it.
Well, we have both mentioned his name a time or two, but the other, as I say, character, if you will, I would have loved to have met in real life, Wilmore Kendall. And in part because I'm a born and bred Oklahoman, as was he. But this guy sounded like a real character too. Sound like he'd fight with just about anybody.
Yes, well, I could go on and on about that. One of the striking things that I learned when I studied Kendall was how many people who knew him never forgot him and wrote me letters, long letters in some cases, about their acquaintance with him. He was a character, but he was a very prickly personality, a brilliant man, a child prodigy, really. He started going to college at the age of 13. But he had, in some ways, a troubled academic life. He became a Yale professor and one of the mentors of William F. Buckley, Jr., and he gave Buckley considerable assistance in writing Buckley's book in 1954 called McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, McCarthy and His Enemies, which is a critique of critics of McCarthy primarily. Buckley and his brother-in-law Bozell wrote it, but it's very clear from various evidence that Kendall had a hand in that. Kendall was a kind of a radical in his youth, as a number of people were, like Meyer, but Kendall never went to Stalinism. He kind of flirted around the corners of Trotskyism, it seems, in the 30s, and became an ardent majority-rule Democrat, a kind of a populist of the first order on the left. But he was also a fierce Cold Warrior. He worked for the CIA for a time, and he was a contentious presence at Yale for about 14 years, from 1947 to 1961, when by mutual agreement, Yale and Kendall parted ways. In fact, they bought him out. It seems that they gave him 5 years of his salary to get rid of him. And he was never made a full professor. He made enemies rather easily, including among people on the right. And Kendall was a political theorist who had a strong faith, almost a mystical faith, in the wisdom of the American people at the grassroots. And that might be traceable to his Oklahoma background to some degree. Although he went to Oxford, he taught at Yale and so on. He was a sophisticate of the eastern United States, if you will, but he didn't quite like what he called the world of the Buckleys, and he returned at the end of his life to teach at the University of Dallas. Kendall, like Meyer and like Kirk, became a convert to Roman Catholicism. Kendall's father was a Methodist minister, and so that was quite a jolt, I suppose, although that conversion did not take place while Kendall's father was alive. Kendall is actually the basis for a short story by Saul Bellow called Mosby's Memoirs. Saul Bellow, the novelist, knew Kendall. And you can see, I don't know how much he might have, fictionalized, but it sounded like Kendall to me, and there are certain ingredients in the story that make it rather clear to those in the know, so to speak, that it was Kendall on whom this Mosby character was patterned. And this is not any disclosure on my part. I think Saul Bellow himself mentioned it, and other people have mentioned it. So Kendall, as you say, was a character, but what he tried to do was to reconcile his Christian faith that he developed later on and his love of the Constitution with this majority rule preference and what you might call populism. So part of what made Kendall tick was he was always distrustful of elites, whether it was left-wing elites or any kind of establishment, including ultimately the conservative establishment. So he spent much of his time in his last years trying to reconfigure conservatism and write what he thought was a better account of it and a better form of strategy for it. And he did much, I think, to Americanize conservatism in the sense that he did not want conservatives to simply look to Europe for inspiration or guidance. He was a constitutionalist, and he argued that the Constitution was a great instrument that conservatives have to be prepared to defend. And he made conservatism more oriented, in his view, toward political battles and not simply toward what he called literary conservatism. So he was a critic of Russell Kirk, and of course there are people who criticize Kendall as too much Rousseauian, that is, too much in the mold of Rousseau, and he did study Rousseau and translate some of Rousseau. And some argued that he was, he himself regarded himself as an egghead McCarthyite. And so he said, and I'll stop with this observation, Kendall said at one point that there were two sources of conservatism in America: McCarthyism and Buckleyism. And by Buckleyism, I think he meant this kind of what he saw as a kind of aristocratic playing up to the Eastern liberal elites and so on, supposedly. And Kendall wanted what he called himself an Appalachians to the Rockies patriot, a heartland patriot. So in some ways, Kendall was a forebear of the populist moment that we have today. And there are some people today who are looking back on Kendall and saying maybe he had some things right. It's a complicated story. I can't begin to describe all of his political philosophy, but I've tried to give you a few of the highlights, and maybe some of your readers or listeners will want to learn more. Fabulous letter writer. He was, as I say, a brilliant man, but as Buckley once said of him, that he could never be in conversation on good speaking terms with more than three people at a time, and you never knew which three those were, and so forth. So Kendall could be difficult, but he was a kind of a heckler, but not everybody appreciated his heckling. And he could take some unusual stands, and he was really a great dissenter from the conservative mainstream, but he left some extraordinary pieces of writing, articles mainly, that still are valued by political scientists, political theorists. And he became somewhat under the intellectual influence of Eric Voegelin and Leo Strauss, two emigre intellectuals from Central Europe who had a great vogue and impact on American conservatism. And Kendall died in 1967, and he was one of the original editors of National Review, but sadly he broke with Buckley a few years later and went his own way.
Yeah, any one of these names we brought up, you could spend an entire hour just talking about these individuals. I mean, these are, as I often say, the well of intellectual conservative history runs deep. It's really a shame sometimes, I feel, that younger conservatives such as myself are oftentimes unaccustomed to these stories because they're really interesting stories. You know, Kendall, if I'm not mistaken, his book, The Conservative Affirmation, I don't know the exact phrase he used, but he made known that his cannons were pointed at Russell Kirk and the conservative mind. That while Kendall was, I suppose you could say, a fan or student or admired Edmund Burke, he didn't like this notion of we're going to import some foreign British statesman to define what it means to be an American conservative. But nor too, like, when I think of someone like Frank Meyer, I don't, I think I've got this right. I don't think Kendall would have all been okay with sort of looking to John Stuart Mill, say, for our intellectual heritage in the United States. It was a very unique, popular. He kind of almost formed his own conservatism that informs conservatism even today.
Yes, and he, as I say, he went his own way. But I think one of his contributions was that he probably made conservatives more aware of the need not to live in a rarefied realm of theory and abstraction, but to defend the mores of what Nixon called in 1969 the great silent majority. And so Meyer represented, to some extent, a moment in the history of this unfolding history of conservatism, of the conservative movement, when it was a defiant minority, and many of them felt that the tides of history were perhaps irrevocably against them. And so it was a minority battling, perhaps losing, whereas Kendall had this almost unaccountable optimism. I think Buckley called it baffling or some word like that, this baffling optimism that the American people were not corrupted. It was the elites that were corrupted. So early on, the conservatives were in a way a kind of the intellectual, a dissident elite. And some of them were very standoffish toward Joseph McCarthy, this rabble-rousing anti-communist senator from Wisconsin. And they didn't find McCarthy a paragon of virtue. And whereas Kendall may not have thought McCarthy was a paragon of virtue, but he thought McCarthy was on the right side of the battle. And so Kendall was a very rare bird when you think about it, an Ivy League professor in favor of Joseph McCarthy. And Kendall kind of enjoyed shocking people, I think, like that. But what he pointed to, and what happened with the conservatives, was that after Goldwater's defeat, and then gradually the political trends of the 60s and 70s taking place and leading to Reagan, conservatives came to believe that maybe they were not on the outside looking in. Maybe they were not doomed to failure, but maybe they were, as some would say, the voice of the silent majority. So conservatism became more confident. It's hard to say which came first, conservative confidence or political victories, but Reagan represents, I think, a key moment, the arrival of Reagan in the White House, when conservatives feel that they've left the outside and entered, so to speak, the promised land of Washington, D.C. That is to say, politically speaking, they were now in the mainstream and could no longer be despised and ignored and dismissed by liberals as people who were just out of sync with the times. So Meyer, in some ways, and the conservatism he expressed, emphasizing the individual so much as opposed to the state, it represents a kind of a feeling that you're under siege. And Kendall argued that no conservatives, if they got their minds together, they've got to reach out to the silent majority. And so he did advocate a kind of, it sounds contradictory perhaps to say, but I think you'll understand, a kind of populistic conservatism. Conservatism had to address the concerns of the ordinary folk, quote unquote. And as I say, Kendall felt, as did I think Meyer and Kirk and others, that the liberal elites were decadent and that they were really the source of much of the trouble of the land. But they were aiming, I think, partly Buckley and company at the intellectual classes to get a foothold there. And Kendall was arguing in his highbrow way that one had to be sure that one is defending the virtuous people out there. He believed the people were still virtuous and that they could be trusted. And Buckley had a Kendall side to him, As I say, Buckley represented many tendencies, and that helped to strengthen his centrality as a kind of a leader, aside from his inherent gifts of fluency and intellect and debating skill and all the rest. I mean, Buckley had many talents, but he represented these tendencies. Buckley, famously said that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the entire 2,000 members of the Harvard University faculty. Now, he said that at a time when the universities were under siege and when it looked like the liberal elites were losing the will to govern effectively in the 60s, the student troubles and so on. So Buckley could express himself as in sympathy with the common man, so to speak, and I say that with no sneer or anything, just as a descriptive. And then, of course, Buckley ran for mayor of New York, and in '65, and that's an important moment for conservatism too, because it starts to get national attention that way. Who is this flamboyant character running? He gets 13% of the vote, and many of the people whom he attracted were what were then called white ethnics in the outer boroughs of New York, the Reagan Democrats, maybe even the Trumpists to some degree, or antecedents of them in our time. So Buckley had this unusual position of being on firing line, 1,400 and some odd shows that he had over 33 years, an incredible achievement. And becoming the face of conservatism, of intelligent conservatism, but still having a kind of charisma about him and expressing things in his own inimitable way that people found attractive. That is, people at outside of the intellectual environs. So Buckley was, in certain ways, a forerunner of this more majoritarian consciousness of conservatism that I mentioned a moment ago.
If we were to fast forward past the ascendance of Reagan, past the 90s, past the contract with America, and I would even say on up to where we're at today, again, speaking as a younger conservative, it seems like we're sort of in this weird crossroads where conservatism has been ascendant in some sense. We've had a demonstrable victory, but there seems to be just a discontent and a raging question, what is conservatism today? Where are we headed with all this? And there's a lot of directions I could go with this, but since you are a historian by trade, I did want to focus on this in particular. You mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation. You were writing this stuff and you didn't know how the story was going to end. You didn't know about the Reagan Revolution. For all you know, Russell Kirk could have been right. This could have been the conservative route, and you could have just been writing about this weird kind of group of hodgepodge intellectuals that just disappear, at some point in history. So I'm wondering from a historian's perspective, what lessons should we draw from this? And I think, as you write, I may be misquoting here, but something to the effect that history is hope, or at least history provides the basis for hope. What can history give us that could maybe anchor the soul of the conservative today? Because we're facing different challenges today than these challenges you're talking about, right? We've had some victories, but now we're not real sure where we're at. So what would you hope for the listener's sake that they could draw from these historical lessons to buoy them in a sense and maybe give hope for a brighter tomorrow?
Yes, I think I said somewhere that history is possibility. We are conditioned, but we're not predetermined by our past. We're not robots. And so there is always some ground for hope, if not always optimism, at least hope. And there's a distinction, I think, to be made between those two. One of the things that is admirable about the conservatives whom I studied was that their devotion to their cause, that is, their devotion to their beliefs, often at considerable financial and other cost in social ostracism and so on, especially in the early days. Russell Kirk gave up a position of teaching at Michigan State University, as it's now called, in 1953, rather than go along with what he considered the deliberate dumbing down of the curriculum. And he became an independent man of letters. And he taught many short-term assignments at different places like Hillsdale College in later years, but he did not have a conventional academic path after that. But he held true to his convictions. There are other examples that I could give, but I'll skip them. So the main point here is that one has to admire the dedication of people like Buckley, who was on the losing end time after time. Think of the Goldwater debacle, the rout of conservatives in 1964. And Buckley foretold it. He told a group of conservative youth, he said, we're going to get beaten badly. And they were kind of shocked because they were all thinking, oh, we're going to win, we're going to win. And of course, it was like 61% for Lyndon Johnson, 38 or so percent for Barry Goldwater. So it was a rout, but it turned out not to be the end of the story. So that I think, if you look back at the people I studied, who were very much beginners in some ways, running against the tide, against the drift of things, to borrow a line from a Robert Frost poem that I like. They have to be admired for that. I think another thing that should be stressed in terms of what one can learn from history is that precisely because of these folks' convictions and energy and so on, they did not surrender the field. And the field changed. Circumstances arose. They helped to create some of those circumstances that made opportunities for them in the political realm, as well as in the intellectual sphere. And they like to quote, and sometimes I've quoted myself, T.S. Eliot's famous statement that there are no lost causes because there are no gained causes permanently, that a gained cause may win at the moment and it may lose someday. So things can go up and down, up and down. So you must keep calm and carry on, to borrow a famous phrase from the British in World War II. So I think that also another point that is demonstrated by the conservative intellectuals is, to quote the line from a book of that title by Richard Weaver, another conservative leader early on, ideas have consequences. So what these people thought and said and did made converts. It made change. And that doesn't mean that every idea wins automatically. In some ways, we can't predict that. But still, it was not hopeless for them to be true to their convictions. I think, if I can quote now from the Italian nationalist Mazzini in the 19th century, who said that ideas rule the world and its events. He said, a revolution is the passage of an idea from theory to practice. And one can argue that in the 1980s, in the Reagan era and beyond then, conservatism, this confluence of 5 different streams of consciousness, if you will, 5 different clusters of people with overlapping interests, etc., that confluence helped to create what was called the Reagan Revolution. Well, that may sound a little melodramatic to say Reagan Revolution, but it was a considerable change at many levels in American society. And so they did affect the way things came to be in our time. And one can argue, I would argue anyway, that Reagan in his policies helped to create the conditions. He was not solely responsible for what happened, but he helped to create the conditions that led to the implosion of the communist empire, the Soviet Union. And that is a monumental achievement. But with that achievement came new challenges for conservatives, namely, well, what do we do next? We had the Cold War. That was kind of the great uniting factor for all these groups. It gave us a kind of sobriety. It gave us a sense of mission. What comes next? And so much of what's been happening ever since the 90s, including now, is a kind of a search for, you might say, a new consensus or some kind of new fusionism for a new era. And if you look back at the intellectual fads and trends of the last 30 years, you see all sorts of cases of sort of attempts to create a new kind of unity among conservatives. You probably wouldn't remember, no, you probably would not remember the Leave Us Alone coalition that Grover Norquist drove along in the 1990s under Clinton, arguing that what unites American conservatives is the desire to be let alone. Leave us alone. Let us have our guns and our own medical care and so forth. And these some of the issues of the Clinton years. So that was one attempt. Then along came something called national greatness, which was propounded by some of the neoconservatives around the Weekly Standard. And then along came George W. Bush, and he had something called compassionate conservatism, which was kind of a dig at Newt Gingrich and some of the things that went on in the Congress under Gingrich. And so Bush wanted to show that conservatism was not, quote, mean-spirited, unquote, compassionate conservatives. Then Rod Dreher, a name you've probably heard, a very popular blogger today, author of a rather new book called Live Not by Lies, and also a book called The Benedict Option, an Orthodox Christian at this point in his life. He had argued in his first book that there was something called crunchy conservatism, conservatives who had a feeling for the environment, crunchy as in granola. Okay. So, and then we have constitutional conservatism, and then there's Trumpism and so forth. So all sorts of attempts have been made and are being made to reconfigure conservatism. Well, right now, I would say the big attempt is, what does one do with the last 4 years in terms of rebuilding conservatism? Do you have Trumpism without the name, without him at the head of the parade, or do you take certain parts of it and try to meld them with others? Do you kind of try to bring back the pre-existing consensus, which some say, I think, overstate the point that it's dead? I think there are many who believe in those same basic principles of national security. Maybe the concern now is communist China, not the USSR of yore, but also people still want liberty, economic liberty, don't want metastasizing federal deficits, etc. And of course, people concerned, social conservatives and others, about the decline, it seems, of American morals and mores, and this kind of atomization of society, and also a sense that many of them have that people with Judeo-Christian convictions are increasingly under siege, under threat again, including perhaps even from government itself. So many of the concerns that the conservatives of yore brought to the fore are still here today, but there's a lot of jostling about, as you quite properly mentioned, and so I think that right now there is an attempt to see how much of the old fusionism remains, or what new ingredients need to be brought. I would say myself, and here's a little editorializing, if I may, and moving beyond the historian hat I wear, and that is, I think we need to retain as conservatives what I call a fusionist sensibility. And by that, I don't mean fusionism as some kind of ism, some kind of quickie formula that's going to answer all our theoretical questions, some kind of abstraction. I agree with Russell Kirk that one has to beware of what I would call the sectarian temptation, or the tendency to be ideologues. You think you have all the answers in 30 seconds or less, so you can get on the TV and spout them, you see. So we have to avoid that kind of tendency to simplify and oversimplify. But I think what I would call a sensibility, of fusionist sensibility, is this. Conservatism has many sources, many roots. And we've explored those in this conversation. And all of them, I think, contribute something to our understanding of human nature, of society, of the good life, of the nature, of the proper nature of government, and so on. And so one may not agree with them. It would be perhaps impossible to agree with everybody at once, because there are very different, divergent strains. Nevertheless, the approach should not be to try to anathematize them, drive them out, or accuse them of some kind of heresy, and move in some a strange new direction, but to try to recover, if you will, or articulate or dig further into the wisdom of conservatism, recognizing that this has been at its best a kind of a coalition which works together, or tries to civilly, and does not try to take the reins and drive everybody away from the field. So that's my little sermonette on that subject. So I think that's where we are. There is a great deal of confusion right now, and the word fusionism is not in high repute in many circles. But I do think that if you think of it as a way of thinking, as a modus vivendi, and that is a means of coexisting and so forth. If you look at it that way, I think it has something to contribute, and then you can read the greats like Russell Kirk and many others, and learn from them and try to apply them and work them out. And no, we will not have perfect agreement, but I think that we'll recognize, especially as conservatives, that there are still great trends out there that are very concerning and that need to be resisted. So it's important, to quote Benjamin Franklin, that we hang together, otherwise we'll all hang separately. So you have to have that sense of a movement. And that sense of a movement is under great strain right now because there are so many competing elements out there. And I'm not trying to pick and choose among them. I say the competing elements need to understand, though, that in some kind of conversation or unity or attempt at it, there is value, and that one must, again, resist what I, again, call this temptation to go it along on the theory that you alone have all the answers. I think that would be a mistake, and it would be off-putting, and it would weaken conservatism going forward.
Yeah, one of the things that I have always profited by in reading of some of this conservative history is, I try to put myself in the shoes of those. What would it have been like to have been one of those students that Russell Kirk told Goldwater probably isn't going to win in '64, and then sure enough, it's one of the most lopsided losses in United States presidential history, right? LBJ just trounces Goldwater. Or what was it like for decades for conservatives to kind of be out of the seats of power? What was it like to live in a world in which the Soviet Union was a viable existential threat to our way of life and our very existence? It's not that we have major problems now, we have major challenges now, but I think sometimes when I say we, I mean younger conservatives or those who don't have maybe the advantage of seeing some of these things play out in time. I think you can unfortunately end up with a warped sense of how bad the situation is or how desperate. There seems to be such desperation sometimes I hear in the voices of those on the right. And I'm not saying that there aren't serious challenges, but I think there's a proper orientation where we can face these things with a good deal of cheerfulness and good-hearted courage and hope, while at the same time acknowledging that things are difficult and challenging.
No, I think you're onto a good point there. I've been struck very much in the last year or two by, since the last election even, by how many people I know who are conservative. And many people, of them are very well educated, and they are upset to the point of despair, and think that really the country's future is in deep jeopardy. And I've been struck also and concerned actually by what I see as the rhetoric of war on the left and in some elements of the right, as opposed to what I would call the Reaganite rhetoric of liberty. If you look at Reagan's rhetoric, and I've done some study of it and a little writing about Reagan's thought and his evolution as a conservative, the central value for him was liberty, which he meant was you could make something of yourself, have opportunity, and so on. That was a kind of a key concept. But right now, I don't find that so universally expressed. There's often criticism of what's called autonomy. And there's a critique to be made of individual autonomy and atomism and in the moral realm. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism is coming from. But I think that we are facing a situation on the right at present where the language of liberty is going to be salient, particularly in terms of freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of speech, dealing with the cancel culture and wokeness. People are losing jobs, livelihoods, suffering ostracism, and so on. And so it's probably going to be fought out in some court cases, some of these battles, I suspect. And that's and so the language of liberty should not disappear from the conservative lexicon. And I worry a little that in the concern for what is seen as the overreach of the left and the aggression and the velocity of the speed with which things are being done in the school systems and so on to change curricula and the like. There's a great concern about that on the right. And so there is, I think, a real fear that if something isn't done, like winning back the Congress supposedly in the next 2 years, then all may be lost. If you're not careful, that kind of logic leads you to a kind of a low-grade civil war. And I don't want to sound melodramatic here, but and I don't think that anything like secession is a likelihood, but there is a kind of micro secession going on in the United States at the present time. By people are moving from different states to different states, and some of that is, I would say, ideologically driven. And we've seen it's been called The Big Sort. That's the title of a book that I really like. Came out about 2010 by a Texas-based sociologist, I think, named Bill Bishop, if you want to look it up. The Big Sort. And he's pointed out how increasingly in our religious practice and in other ways, in geographical dispersion and concentration, increasingly people are settling into communities of the like-minded. And so that is a tendency, and we all know about the polarization that's going on. So I hope that conservatives, in resisting what needs to be resisted, and I hope also that those on the left who are trying to really gallop ahead here, while they have the power and the opportunity, I hope both sides will recognize that, as Edmund Burke said, men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. And it's one of my favorite quotations. So if the level of passion that we see right now in the system is great, and you've properly identified it, it's out there on the right, and I can testify it, as I tell you, from personal acquaintance with conservatism and just my own reading of the online discussion and other sources. So that is a very concerning trend. And you haven't asked the question, but I'll answer the question, how does one turn this around? I don't have a quick, 30-second solution there. I do see some grounds for hope. I see some pushback against some of the more extreme manifestations of illiberalism on the left. And I think that there are possibilities of alliances between conservatives and dissident liberals, a growing number of them, in opposition to illiberalism on either end of the spectrum. So there are some possibilities there for improving the condition of our politics, but it's going to be an effort.
I do want to ask you in closing, what would you hope, from a historical perspective, younger conservatives such as myself would gain from history, from American history? Like, what lesson or lessons do you want us to pull out?
Well, that the people who went before us, particularly in this country, had many struggles, and many of them made many sacrifices. Look at the Civil War. We now estimate that 750,000 people died in that war, and there were only 33 million people in the country. An enormous tragedy. It's only in quite recent times that we've had the kind of broad prosperity that is so taken for granted now. People today, it's amazing to watch young people, anyone, with the cell phones and the incredible resources available and that little device that we hold in our hands. I think there's a tendency to take that for granted. And I think what history can tell us is that the American story has downer moments as well as exhilarating moments. Any nation's story is not perfect, but that there is much to admire and to respect and to want to, shall I say, conserve in the American experience and our knowledge of it, and our going forward, particularly in how we organize our politics, how we live with one another, the sources of our upbringing, the sources of our prosperity, if you will. There are many, many things that can be learned. So when I study people, I've studied Herbert Hoover extensively, as you may know. I've written several biographical volumes about him, a remarkable American figure, and something of a patron saint of the conservatives of the 1940s and 50s and early 60s. there are people like that who deserve to be better known. There are truly some remarkable American people who are our progenitors. And there's a tendency today, and it's really deep now in many parts of our society, to look at the dark side, look at the failures, and to argue now, and this is where much of the argument is going on right now, argue that America is essentially a nation born in slavery and injustice and in oppression, and that it is flawed from the start, and so on. I would not deny the blemishes, and some of them are deep and hurtful blemishes, but I would also say that America, in many ways, was a success story and an inspiration to the rest of the world. So I think what we need to commit ourselves to is improvement, but not to radical reform that will quite possibly lead to something worse. So you have to understand not only American history, you have to understand the alternatives to American history in the last 100 years or so. I've done a lot of study of communism, Nazism, fascism, World War II, and so on. And the horrors of the experience within living memory of many people should not be just conveniently forgotten. There's an organization called victimsofcommunism.org that I like, which is trying to preserve the memory of the over 100 million people who've died at the hands of communist governments in the last century. Think of that. So America can look quite good by contrast. And I think a conservative way of looking at our history is not to look exclusively forward and imagine, like John Lennon, you can imagine a perfect world somewhere, some fantasy, some utopia. I don't think conservatives look that way toward the future. They look to the future with hope. They are willing and are eager often to try to improve our society in different ways. That's a wonderful aspiration. But they also look at the history comparatively and look at the American experience compared to the experience of communist China, where something like 70 million people died under Mao Zedong. Or look at people, I've met them in the past in my research, people who are refugees from communism, refugees from Nazi Germany, and so on. They came to America, and they loved America, and do love America, those who are still among us with that experience. So a conservative perspective on history, I think, looks back and sees how mottled history has been, how dark it can often be. And therefore, I think we can derive a certain amount of hope from the possibilities that America has presented and to some extent achieved. So I don't think we should just reject history and say, oh, I'm going to imagine a brighter future and I'm going to wreck everything and drive out and cancel everybody who disagrees with me and so on. That's a very dangerous and I think fruitless path. So look back to America, as in the words of a friend of mine, Wilfred McClay, has written a book, America, Land of Hope. It's a history textbook. He's a historian who's going to Hillsdale College now. So there's a textbook that I might just put in a little plug for, my friend's textbook, that shows American experience not as perfect, but as in many ways to be admired and certainly to be conserved and improved in a way that is not going to jeopardize the entire underpinnings of the society. So that's how I think conservatives should look at history. Look at America as for its not only its faults, but for its achievements. Look at American experience and compare it and contrast with the terrible turnings that many societies took in the not too distant past, and a few societies today are still doing. Look at Venezuela as we speak, for example. Look at history that way, and I think that will give you a greater degree of wisdom and perspective. And history, as I say, is possibility, but it's not a blank slate. And we have to remember what went before. And I think that will give us both inspiration and some cautionary guidance. I don't want it to be said of us, as sometimes it's been said that this is from Bismarck. He said that fools say they learn from experience. I prefer to learn from other people's experience. And that would be historical experience. So I would put in that that plea to younger people of conservative persuasion, or maybe not of conservative persuasion. Don't just look upon the past as a set of just terrible evils. There are evils out there, and you've got to recognize them. But look upon the past and see what you can find to inspire as well as instruct. And then get up in the morning and go forward and do your best.
Well, Mr. Nash, it has been a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure, and all the best to you.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
This episode's listener mail comes from Andrea, a Twitter follower at TXGirly83. And she DM'd me the following. I'm catching up on some old episodes after a long hiatus. Specifically, I'm listening to the Election Day episode, and I have a retrospective question. You spent some time criticizing a protest vote on a typically unrealistic view that the other guy is an existential threat. And I'm just wondering if you have reevaluated whether the former guy may actually be an existential threat in light of his election lies, the events of January the 6th, and the Republican Party's subsequent whitewashing. I realize that Donald Trump does not exist in a vacuum, and he would not have been able to lead a healthy party or nation down this path, but is that also not the case for other terrible leaders in history? Well, thank you, Andrea, for that question. She's referring, of course, to the episode that dropped on Election Day, when I was trying to offer some thoughts not so much on who to vote for, but how to think about voting. And she's referring to a portion of that episode in which she's right. I did criticize the notion of a protest vote rooted in the idea that one of the major party candidates is an existential threat to the United States. While there have been various versions of this argument going back for as far back as at least my political memory allows, this really seemed to take root in the 2016 election and was often used as justification for voting for or supporting Donald Trump. The Flight 93 mindset, as it's come to be known, kind of this idea that the situation is so dire and Hillary Clinton is such a threat to the continual existence of the United States of America that whatever qualms one might have about Trump himself, none of that really mattered. This was a do or die, charge the cockpit. We're all going down in a fiery ball of flames, so let's just make this last Hail Mary end run. Now, there are lots of reasons people may have voted for Donald Trump in 2016. This certainly wasn't the only reason. And there are a lot of decent, good, justified, well-thought-through reasons. So I'm not criticizing anyone who just voted for Donald Trump. But this line of thinking, I think, sometimes can be employed to shut off the pesky parts of our brain that make us question, well, maybe this isn't the best decision. If we can paint things as an existential threat, then the choice becomes simple. Maybe not easy, but very simple. What we did not know on Election Day, of course, is what was going to follow. Staying up until the late hours of the night and on into the next morning not knowing who was going to be the president. Donald Trump alleging and then outright repeating the big lie that the election had been stolen from him. The events that, as Andrea points out, led up to the incursion on the U.S. Capitol on January the 6th, and the Republican Party's seeming unwillingness to confront those events. An unwillingness to purge Donald Trump as the leader of the GOP in any meaningful sense. In other words, if I understand Andrea correctly, if I had known on Election Day what I know now, what we all know now, would I have changed my tune? Would I have said, well, actually, in this particular instance, Donald Trump does represent an existential threat to the United States of America? Now, before I attempt to answer that question, I want to give a little background as to my perspective on the events since the election, specifically the incursion on January the 6th. This is a hot-button issue. A lot of people on the right get fired up on one side or the other, so I'll just give my view so that I'm laying my cards out on the table. And in my view, January 6th represents one of the most significant attacks on our most precious inheritance as Americans, the peaceful transfer of power. There are lots of voices on the right that will readily acknowledge it was wrong, but will with an equal breath point out that it was equally wrong, all the riots and deaths and vandalizing of property and entire city blocks that were taken over during the riots we saw last summer. I don't in any way want to minimize those events, but I do believe it is incumbent upon us to recognize the very sharp distinctions that should be made between these two, both terrible things. The January 6th incursion on the U.S. Capitol was far more severe, in my view, than the multiple riots that took place over the summer, not in terms of life lost or damage to property or how long they lasted or how widespread they were. But there are three important ways in which the incursion on the Capitol on January the 6th is more severe. First, it was encouraged, however indirectly, by, at the time, the most powerful person in the United States, Donald Trump, which included months of disinformation and fomenting of anger that led to these events, including his call for his supporters to march on the Capitol in a speech he gave to them immediately before the incursion. One can hold the view that there were questionable things that took place in the election, while simultaneously recognizing that in an ordered society of the rule of law, we have courts and mechanisms to work out those differences. And it is not only inappropriate, it is, what is the phrase George Bluth Sr. says?
There's a good chance I may have committed some light treason.
An act of light treason for the President of the United States to behave in such an irresponsible manner that led to this unfortunate event. Second, this is different than the riots we saw over the summer in that it was an attack on the nation's capital. This was not a neighborhood, it wasn't a business district, or even an entire city. It was a direct attack on the center of American democracy, on our institution of a free republic. And third, it was a direct attack on the very process of the peaceful transfer of power. So with these three things in mind, in order for there to be an equivalent example, say, on the left, we would almost have to have a scenario in 2020, say, where it wasn't, I'll just say, it wasn't Biden, but it was Bernie Sanders that had won the nomination. And there were some questions that got tied up in the court and ultimately winds up in the Supreme Court. And so as the Supreme Court is deliberating this case, Sanders v. Trump, Bernie Sanders gives a speech instigating a mob of Antifa to storm the United States Supreme Court during the very case that was allegedly going to help decide the outcome of the 2020 presidential race. Now, it is true that it seems evident the participants in the incursion didn't have a grand plan, or at least weren't united in exactly what they were going to do when they broke into the Capitol. And in retrospect, they had little hope of successfully ending the peaceful transfer of power, and that's good news, but I don't think it excuses the fact that it still represents a serious and treasonous attack on the people of the United States. An unsuccessful coup is still horribly wrong and problematic, and that it weakens the barriers that prevent future attempted coups, and one that may eventually be successful. If the listener is interested in me taking a much deeper dive into the events on January the 6th, you can go back to listen to episode number 75, A Peaceful Transfer of Power, but I'm just going to leave it there. My point in saying all that is I want to lay all my cards out on the table to try to give you some sense of how severe a problem I think January 6th represented, let alone all the events that led up to it, let alone the subsequent whitewashing, as Andrea quite frankly corrected it, that the GOP has participated in, and trying to just put this behind us, or in some cases, continuing to go along with the lie that there was some sort of a grand scheme of the left to literally steal the election. So, in answer to Andrea's question, was or is Donald Trump an existential threat to the United States? Well, I think that kind of depends on what we mean by existential threat, how we're framing this question. And in the sense I had intended it in that episode, that the election of either major party candidate in either 2016 or 2020 would itself represent an existential threat to the continuation of the United States, then no, I still don't believe Donald Trump was or is an existential threat. And if anything, 4 years of Trump's administration would demonstrate to me that while he had the inklings or maybe even desire to be a strongman demagogue, he seemed to lack the basic skills of patience, cunning, and ideological consistency to amass the necessary elite support to pull off something like that. This isn't Venezuela, this isn't Russia. The United States of America has a multitude of built-in institutions that would make it really difficult for any would-be demagogue to permanently undermine the fabric of the nation. And I don't think Donald Trump was ever going to be up to that task. Another 4 years of a Donald Trump administration would have dealt additional damage to our institutions. but I believe it ultimately would have damaged the Republican Party more than the ability of the United States to continue to enjoy the legitimate elected leaders in years to come. Now, that's not the same as saying that Trump's threat to the viability of the United States is trivial. As Andrea rightly points out, none of this would be possible were it not for an alarming number of Americans, many of whom I believe are very sincere and are, or at least believe themselves to be, very patriotic, who are nonetheless willfully ignorant of the dangers posed by Trump's attempt to literally steal the election, or the, in my opinion, even more disturbing number of high-ranking elected officials who either believe the big lie themselves and perpetrate this myth, or, even worse still, deliberately conceal the truth out of some sense of political self-preservation. This is a big deal. And if it continues to fester and gets worse, it theoretically could represent an existential threat to the United States. But my larger point is that the election itself, the actual act of you walking into a voting booth, of you casting a ballot for one candidate over another, that really is less of a concern of mine than the daily decisions we as a people make, the ways in which we act, and the ways in which a lot of us did act that threatened to undermine the system and led up to the events of January the 6th. Had the 75 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump, had all of them simply accepted the results of the election, and many of them did, but had all of them done so, or maybe better put, had all of them been willing to accept the legal process whereby Trump's legal team fought in court cases, questioning the results of elections in this race or that, which, regardless of what I think about the merits of those cases, is a perfectly honorable, reasonable way to go about this, had all of Donald Trump's voters accepted those court cases for what they were, the way in which people work out their differences in a society of ordered liberty, then it really wouldn't have mattered how unhinged Trump himself became in the election's aftermath. In other words, the vote for Donald Trump, or Trump himself, was not an existential threat, so much as the subsequent events, and the way people have behaved and continue to behave. Now, I do want to emphasize, because I don't think their stories get shared nearly enough or get enough attention, that much of the reason the fabric of American democracy held, much of the reason Donald Trump was unsuccessful in stealing the election, was due to the multitude of individuals who very much did do the courageous and the difficult thing. As Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt pointed out in his excellent piece for The Bulwark in praise of those who resist temptation, and just as a brief aside, I enjoy pieces in The Bulwark. They are so radically anti-Trump sometimes, unfortunately, that I wouldn't necessarily send someone there for, say, an objective viewpoint. But trust me, David Holt's piece in particular, in praise of those who resist temptation, was an excellent piece and worth your time. Mayor Holt points out quite rightly that there were many unsung heroes at the state and local levels who refused to bow to the temptation, a pressure as great sometimes as direct phone calls from the president himself to realistic threats of losing an upcoming election, or even threats to their life. And it is these individuals at very lowly offices who are responsible for why we had a peaceful transfer of power. Our system was tried, but the system held. And that's worth celebrating, even as we recognize it should have never been challenged in this way. And from a personal level, even as I recognize that the two major party candidates weren't individuals I would ever want to elect a president. Again, you can be simultaneously disappointed with who has been elected to the highest office and still celebrate this most precious inheritance that is so rare in human history of the peaceful transfer of power. Now, as I've alluded to, the persistence of those in my party, of some of those in my party, to continue to undermine the results of the 2020 election, do in some non-trivial degree represent at least the potential for an existential threat against the United States. And I want to be really clear here, I'm not talking about the legal efforts of challenging votes. I'm not talking about the multitude of ways that states are looking at how votes are taking place. And while I might not personally agree with all of the, air quotes at times, reforms that they're trying to take place, I am also perfectly happy to endure reforms that I personally don't like if it means that the voters in that state can rest assured that their vote will count, that the election process is not fraudulent. But if either party or if some group ever does succeed in overturning the results of a race, or if we reach the point where a sizable percentage of the country willfully believes elections, not just a single race, but a predominant number of elections at any given time are truly fraudulent or controlled by outsiders, illegitimate groups. If we actually lose this precious inheritance, the peaceful transfer of power, then yes, we would have experienced an existential threat, the likes of which may permanently damage the blessing of liberty and the rule of law that we enjoy. But I think it's important we hold two things in mind about that liberty. First, liberty is always in danger. As Ronald Reagan famously said, it's only one generation away from being lost. But I also believe a society of ordered liberty such as ours is remarkably resilient to such dangers. As such, I think the best orientation is to be vigilant to defend liberty, but not to get carried away with single shocks to the system, as it would be extraordinarily rare for a single event or election to represent an actual existential threat to that liberty. We ought to be vigilant, but not fearful. If I could take an admittedly imperfect example, I believe that the fabric of our ordered liberty works somewhat like a marriage. Okay, plenty of marriages fail. All marriages take work, and if they are to be maintained, at least a certain degree of concern about the possibility that events or lack of efforts might lead to the marriage falling apart. Now, I'm not married. I'm not a marriage expert, so let me, I'm just speaking in generalities here, but I would say that we can't just take it for granted that our marriage will always be there, say, if we aren't careful to maintain the marriage. But that said, I don't think it would be a healthy marriage if every challenge or every dispute or disagreement that represents a wedge to the fabric and the unity of the marriage, if every time we treat that as an existential threat to the marriage. In fact, that approach may ultimately hasten the collapse of the marriage, as it could lead to radical or unhinged or impulsive behaviors. Now, to torture this analogy a little bit further, we might say that the events on January the 6th, the incursion on the U.S. Capitol, represent a sort of unsuccessful marital affair. People storm into the Capitol with makeshift handcuffs from zip ties, and there was actually a noose outside for Mike Pence. The people that were in the Capitol probably had a multitude of incentives or ideas in mind as to what they would do when they get there, and there, in my view, were some who were fully prepared to and probably intent on perpetrating violence against our elected officials and forcibly trying to stop the transfer of power process. But they were not successful. In the analogy, one of our partners in the marriage was willfully unfaithful, but ultimately unable to go through with the affair, because maybe the love interest simply wasn't interested themselves. Now, at present, we the people are like a married couple, one where an unsuccessful affair has been discovered, and unfortunately no true soul-searching or marital counseling has been sought. Maybe one of the parties in the marriage is in denial, living with a would-be adulterer and just hoping that things will go back to normal without having to do the actual hard work of dealing with the situation. All analogies are imperfect. They break down eventually, and certainly this one does. The nation is not a married couple, and I don't think we're quite as far gone as this analogy, but it is a serious situation, and eventually it's going to have to be dealt with in a manner our current leadership, frankly on both sides of the aisle, are unwilling to confront. In fact, just to address that, because I don't want to spend all my time just beating up on my party, the Democratic Party has not been operating in good faith either, or at least the majority or their leadership. Nancy Pelosi, in particular, Speaker of the House, has used this as a wedge issue. She's made the second impeachment of Donald Trump and the January 6th commission a partisan affair, very deliberately designing this in such a way that would make it extremely difficult for sympathetic or Republicans that are theoretically at least persuadable to the cause to go along with this. And in my mind, this represents a much larger problem than just pointing to one political party or one side of the political divide and saying, well, their willingness to go along with all this explains everything. Unfortunately, we have two national parties both disinterested in the long-term viability and health of the United States. And I do hope in the years to come that changes. While there are plenty of Democrats and Republicans that have behaved responsibly, the predominant forces on both parties seem largely incentivized to continue to play this partisan game for temporary electoral wins rather than going to marriage counseling, so to speak. Now, fortunately, a nation is typically more resilient than a marriage. because its failure depends on far more than the failure of two people. There's 330-odd million Americans, and there's always going to be some of us that fail. We also have the benefit of long-standing institutions that help keep things going even when we have widespread failure at the top, and widespread failure among the masses. Now, perhaps someday down the road, this will be seen as a sad chapter in American history that was ultimately reconciled, or perhaps this is the latest in a series of challenges to the fabric of the United States that ultimately does doom our system of government. But I still believe that that ultimate outcome rests with the countless decisions each of us make in our daily lives, far more than with any one candidate we might vote for on Election Day.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.